Awesome. Hello, everyone. Today is Tuesday, June 4th, 2024. This is a meeting of the SIG Network Policy API subgroup to SIG Network. It is a CNCF sponsored meeting, so we need to follow their guidelines, which basically boil down to be nice to each other and don't use bad language. So that's where we're at today. Pretty couple things on the agenda. We can go ahead and, well, I guess one thing we haven't been doing prior to hopping into the agenda lately, which I think we stopped doing a long time ago, was issue triage. So there is actually, for folks who don't know, a link for or a label on upstream issues with the area network policy. So we're basically, as a community, kind of responsible for those. I just looked, I'll paste the link here. It's in our top level on the agenda as well, but you can look at it there. The only one open right now is opened by Dan, so I'm assuming it's triaged, and that we don't need to actually do anything. But in the future, it'd be good, maybe not every meeting, but once a month to just make sure we're keeping our eye on there.
I mean, nobody's really looked at that for a long time, so
yeah,
it's to look at it.
Cool. I just looked at it, and your issue, the network policy test for blocking north-south traffic, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, let's pull it up. Sweet. So this is the label I was talking about. And yeah. Okay. Dan, do you want to give a quick summary on this? I think it's pretty straightforward, but.
I don't even remember, so I have to reread it.
We'll read it with you then. Okay.
It's got a lot of labels on it. Has it been triaged but just not marked as triaged? Or what's the bar for triaged?
Issues that sit around untouched for like 6 months get untriaged automatically now. So it just sort of force us to come in and look at them again. And I guess it will probably get triaged by the SIG network meeting on Thursday if we don't touch it. But
well, it's on us.
If somebody feels relevant, like writing an E to E test, then
But it's still a relevant issue, right, Dan? Like, I think we need an E to E test regardless, so it should be triaged. We just need someone to pick it up.
Yeah, so I guess we could triage accept it since we still agree that we need that E to E test. And there's discussion that we should probably remove the good first issue.
Yep, agreed. Because shouldn't have help wanted and good first issue.
I think you can, but I think that we agreed that it was a little too tricky to be a first issue.
Oh, Damon was gonna do it. What happened here? He probably just hasn't gotten to it. Let's see.
No, he's been doing other stuff anyway, so.
Well, maybe this will poke it. I have to do bots. Let me just move the. Oh, I can't do it. Remove good first issue. Is the command remove? Can I do that?
I think it'd be remove label.
Hyphen.
Yeah.
Let's see. Come on, bot.
It's probably like good first issue cancel or something. Don't worry about it.
I can go back and figure it out. I always battle with the bot. Okay, yeah, so no one needs to raise a hand right now. We already have someone assigned to this, but if we have someone on the call, this is a good like little bite-sized contribution to Core Cube. It's kind of a cool thing to check off the list for people watching if they want to get started. Okay, cool. So yeah, trying to do that. maybe once a month, I think is going to be really good. I know we haven't done it in a while, and it was because not many issues were popping up with the area network policy label, but that's still kind of on us as a community to own. So the triage link is up here somewhere, right here in the agenda. So cool. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Hunter. I wasn't here last meeting. I read through the agenda notes. Whoever did that, great job. But so I think this is coming off the discussion from that. Do you want to kind of fill us in, Hunter?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so to recap, yeah, last time, Nadia had proposed a dry run mode. So thanks, Nadia, for bringing that up. And essentially it would be a configuration for the CNI, so that when you add, like, say, an admin network policy, it would not do anything to your connections in the cluster. It would just log whether or not it would deny the connection. So that was the proposal. So I guess last time we started talking about implementation and stuff along those lines. But I guess it was like a new idea for me. So initially I thought this does conflict with the same feature we had proposed on like the upstream user tooling roadmap. But I guess I just didn't, I wasn't able to articulate my thoughts that well right then. So I guess I wanted to take a step back and talk about whether we think this feature adds anything new, or whether we think this feature is already kind of subsumed within the upstream user tooling. So yeah, we had a bit of a discussion on this.
In the issue.
GitHub
Yeah.
issues. So I just put that there. Yes, so basically, like at KubeCon, we proposed this scenario for the upstream user tooling. And we did get some nice feedback around it, so I created an issue about it. It's not that well written, to be frank, but I guess it is something we were thinking about already. In my mind, there were, I guess the main thing in my mind is it seems like again, to summarize, you could have the CNIs like downstream looking at the exact connections and saying, oh, this would be denied by this admin network policy. Or you could have upstream saying, like, consider all the possible connections which would be denied. So there's like a theoretical, or I mean, like all the potential connections, and then there's like the actual connections happening in the cluster. And so in my mind, the all possible connections is clearly like a bit more information than the actual connections happening on a CNI. So I guess, yeah, the first point is that I think we do get more information from the upstream user tooling. And that's already like tooling that we've built. So I was wondering if we want to invest effort in the downstream effort. And then another thing, the main thing I was thinking about was if we have upstream tooling, I guess this is kind of something since I joined, folks have been saying like we really want upstream tooling instead of like a downstream specific tooling. If we really want that upstream tooling, it would become mixed messaging to users if we say, hey, use this policy assistant some of the times, but like when it comes to like important stuff, like don't use it. Like then I feel like why would anyone ever use the policy assistant? If we're telling them to use downstream tooling, and then that does seem to go against our like core ideas that we should have upstream tooling. But yeah, I wanted to open to the floor to everyone else.
I think Dan had his hand up first.
Yeah, so we don't currently have logging as an action in the admin network policy, right? We've talked about it, but it's not actually there in the API. So I feel like, you know, if we add this dry run mode, we are essentially forcing everybody to implement logging. But if we had logging, then people could just do this themselves without needing a dry run mode, right? They could just write an admin network policy that says log this if you see this connection. So maybe we should just, you know, maybe we just need an NPEP for add logging.
Yeah, okay, so I suggested that. So that's almost correct. We don't have logging, but using dry run mode is not exactly the same as just using logging, because basically you replace the action in the dry run mode. You replace any deny, skip, allow action with like log only. And that if you just try to do the logging itself somehow, you would need to either like change the action manually for every rule in your admin network policy or use something else based on how we designed that, really. And I'm also not sure if that should be required or also, like, it definitely depends on the logging, and that's what it says, I guess, in the issue description also. So that's something we need to figure out. Generally speaking, lots of implementations do have some kind of logging, and yeah, it may be some other type of observability, not necessarily in the logs format even.
Well, the key differentiator between the two, right, is for logging, you have to generate traffic. For policy system, it's a static analysis tool, right?
Yeah, we are getting to that, actually. That was just about like the possibility of even using dry run mode if we don't have logging action defined in the NP. So I guess that's kind of doable. But yeah, then another point, I will try to summarize my comment from the issue. I think these are just two slightly different use cases, right? So first, when you create network policies, you have like your intent, basically a list of connections that you think you want to allow. Let's say, considering you deny everything else and you have a list of connections you want to allow. Then this tooling or like static analysis, it will help you confirm that the network policies that you created actually implement the intent you had, so that it allows all the connections you think you want to allow. And then the dry run mode is slightly different because it works on a real cluster, so it may show you that actually you did not allow all the connections you should have allowed. Let's say, I gave an example, like if you've forgotten that your namespace is being monitored by a monitoring namespace, let's say, and you forgot to allow ingress connections, and then you see just something doesn't work in your cluster. So that could potentially, you can't figure this out with the static analysis because you just don't know that you should allow that. But then with the dry run kind of thing, you can see that some connection is being dropped, investigate why, and figure out if that's what you want.
But with a dry run thing, you still wouldn't see the connections being dropped. That's where I'm confused, right? Like no rule is going to be enforced.
You would see it logged. So it will say, oh, I'm not dropping it now, but I will as soon as you apply this network policy. And you basically review that and see the connection you don't want to be dropped in that list. And you're like, no, that's not what I wanted. And then you have a chance to kind of change your network policy itself. Yeah, and there is another like example for FQDN, but yeah, maybe we can just ignore it for now. Yeah, I see a lot of hands.
Yeah, I think Nathan was up, or Hunter. Yeah, you got it, Hunter.
Or yeah, I guess just to immediately respond to that, unless Nathan had a comment on that one. I guess like this example kind of sounds like I guess maybe on my part, like needing to better educate about the policy assistant and like what we envision for this feature, because in my mind, like you would see all of the allowed and all of the denied connections for a policy. So it wouldn't be possible for you to miss anything. Like I guess in the example we were just saying, you're saying, oh, we think it matches our intent, but then later we find that it drops in the monitoring namespace. But the policy assistant would tell you that it drops in the monitoring namespace in the first place.
How would it do that? I mean, if let's say I have just a deny all, right, and just a couple of pods allowed, will at least like every single pod in the cluster that will be dropped by deny all?
Yeah, it would say all of them would be dropped, and like the way we would display that information is still like up in the air, but it would express that.
Yeah, I mean, I just expect something equivalent to reading the network policy itself, right? I mean, it will have kind of the same amount of information. These are two connections or two pods that will be allowed, and then everything else will be dropped. I assume people won't go and read every single pod in the cluster. I mean, after the static analysis, I assume they have done that before designing the network policy itself. So, I mean, it may be difficult for them to figure out that in that deny all, there is something that they actually want to allow without seeing which connections actually exist in the cluster. Because, I mean, it does have this information kind of implicitly as the network policy itself, right? That's where it's all coming from. But it just figuring out which connections actually do exist in the cluster may be tricky. Well,
So it sounds kind of like this, like the actual CNI dry run would kind of educate people about the connections they have. And yeah, I guess like saying that we don't want people to have to know the connections beforehand when using this tooling.
I mean, if we could get an information about every single pod in the cluster and which connections actually exist, that would be nice, but I don't know if that's possible.
I really think it's a subset personally, right? Like static analysis is the wider set, and then enriching that static analysis with cluster specific context. That'd be great. But I just want to give it to Nathan for 2 seconds. Sorry, Hunter, because he's had his hand up for a minute.
Yeah. I just want to speak to like the implementation specifics of this idea. So this part of the assumption of this feature proposal is that policy enforcement occurs in user space, which not every implementation does that. So in Cilium, for example, we don't actually do policy enforcement in user space. We do it in the kernel. And so we would have to change a number of kernel data structures and fire like kernel events up into user space to let them know that this was going on. And we feel that an audit mode, which is something we already have, covers this case. I think that this kind of feature would only really be useful in large clusters with lots of teams and lots of like policy creators. And the idea of creating this feature for that use case, which is I think the use case that you could most argue needs it, because why would you need this feature in a smaller cluster, is very difficult to implement. And also, I just think a very bad way of deciding policy enforcement. If you're in a multi-team, large cluster environment, there is no way of knowing if your audit mode has covered everything that's going on in the cluster. There might be cron jobs that occur on a monthly basis that you missed. And so I just think that this is it's not just that I think that this feature is difficult to implement, which it is. I also think this feature is somewhat dangerous because it could give someone the false impression that they have covered everything going on in their cluster and that their policy is now fine. And so let's go ahead and commit it. And then like a month later, you know, something breaks in their cluster and they're like, well, I ran this thing and it said that it was fine. So I just don't think that there's a substitute for actually understanding the policy enforcement that's going on. it's definitely something that the Cilium community, I just don't think you're going to find anybody who's going to implement this. And yeah, just to get back to the implementation point, not all enforcement occurs in user space.
I think Dan has a hand up.
So yeah, I was commenting in chat as well. It's not assuming that policy enforcement happens in user space. Like I don't think anybody here is actually writing something that does policy enforcement in user space. It's just assuming that you have some way of logging to user space when a policy is enforced, which is a feature that we have talked about, but you know, that's what I was saying at the beginning. It's not actually part of the spec right now. Yeah, but I agree with what you're saying about, like, you know, false sense of security and like what other people are saying. It seems to me like, you know, maybe we should push forward with adding the logging or tracing or whatever feature as a somewhat standardized thing, maybe not fully standardized, but at least a recommendation maybe. And then, you know, people who want to test things out using that, well, okay, yeah, you know, it can be hard to write rules that will trigger logging without otherwise affecting what happens with the traffic. But
Right.
yeah, I feel like the user space tooling should, I don't know, I guess we haven't seen how badly people are going to shoot themselves in the foot with this yet.
Right. I mean, if the use case is that you just apply a deny all in dry run mode and see what's going to be dropped, and you design your all your policies based on that, it's not really the best way to do that. But then even getting back to the example of some cron jobs running, right, periodically, or something else happening even once a day or so, if you don't already know or like remember about that when you design the network policies, there is nothing that can help you. You will just drop this traffic and you'll figure it out afterwards, right? So this mode is kind of just helps you in case, just helps you verify you've covered everything you wanted, more or less. And then let's say you could run that for a month in a cluster, for example, just to check and like potentially find that cron job or something else that's happening that you didn't expect. So, I mean, I don't think that should be used to design the network policies based on the output of that thing, but it could help you just be more sure that you don't break anything. I guess it's like at least the initial intent for that was this.
I think we have to remember our users though. Like, we're talking admins, they should have some knowledge of the overall structure of their cluster, right? And admin network policy isn't going to be just like thrown around by developers who don't have a context of the entire cluster. I tend to agree with Nathan on I don't want users to be building their admin network policy architecture by applying like dry run policies and like, because I've seen how that gets rigid and ugly at the end of the day. Like, they should have an architecture in mind, but way before even thinking about that. However, like, logging is totally a separate feature from dry run. I agree there. So Hunter, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess just piggybacking off that, yeah, I could foresee like a lot of situations where if someone's using dry run, they do shoot themselves in the foot. Like if you only dry run for like an hour, but then another connection happens like every 5 hours or something. And then I guess an implementation thought that maybe needs more time for people to think about, but like at the end of the day, this would have to be a distributed logging mechanism. Like CNIs as they are today run as daemon sets on each node. So if you like Nathan was saying, this is probably most useful for a large cluster. You would have to aggregate all the logs for maybe 1,000 nodes. What kind of mechanism are we using for that? And I guess a third point, like if Like, should we encourage people to have a best effort, like use Policy Assistant to see all the allowed connections, like is monitoring there? Make sure you check that, etc. Should we use that? And then encourage them to use network observability tools because, you know, there might always be something you miss, like drop packets, even if you use the dry run mode, maybe there's something you missed and you should just always be monitoring for extra drops. Like, is that a more robust approach to have them like think more strongly using the static analysis and then monitor with network observability?
I don't hate it. I'm gonna let Nathan go.
Yeah, I don't have a direct comment on what Hunter just said, but I wanted to circle back on another point about implementation, which is that just going off of Cilium, we flatten the policies into map structures. And I think other BPF approaches take a similar or use a similar approach. And we use that BPF map structure in doing updates and deletes as we're checking. And so the map isn't just some static thing where we can insert a new type of like policy key that's like, well, ignore this one. It actually creates like a functional entry. And so the only way we could implement something like this, where we're dry running on just one policy, not the whole cluster, or like an audit mode, I guess you would call it, is to create an entirely new copy of the BPF map specifically just for that policy, and actually for every policy, right? So if you had more than one of these policies floating around, you'd have to create a map structure for each and every one of them that gets checked to see if it would get dropped, but then revert to the normal map structure in actual enforcement. And so if obviously that's not something Cilium is going to do. And so in order for us to implement this feature, we would have to overhaul our entire policy engine. And it also feels, I'm very suspicious of this feature as belonging in SIG network API or SIG policy API. It feels very odd to me to have a dry run mechanism defined in the API for all CNI implementations, when this feels like a very enterprise feature to me. That's something like, it's like an advanced feature that a CNI might implement, where you could like tag a specific policy within some proprietary UI. But to define it for all CNI implementations, it just, I don't know. I don't necessarily question the usefulness of this idea in the long run. I can understand how someone would see this as being useful, but does it belong as an API level field?
Yeah, well, that is a very valid question, and actually also one of the questions asked in the issue itself, right? And I mean, we could discuss based on that. I'm not sure if there are still like some concerns about the use case itself, and if it's needed, we can discuss that. But I've heard that way too many times coming from cluster admins,
Right.
and not only. So I have no doubts that it like could be potentially useful. And then if we also can document it or do something to make sure people don't misuse it in any way. I'm not sure what's the worst way to misuse that. But anyway, there are like a couple things we could discuss that, and maybe we could do that in the issue comments itself, right? If you have something on the usefulness of that at all, or on the use cases, let's discuss that. And then from the implementations point of view, right, it's also very important. I'm not sure if I understand the Calico architectures or Cilium architecture good enough, right, to say, but maybe you could do the like separate maps for something that only is logged and just ignore this network policy otherwise, and then have everything else as usual. I mean, yeah, maybe we can discuss that also, how reasonable it is even to try to implement that. And then also if it belongs to the API itself is like also a good question. It kind of is tied to the logging feature itself. Maybe we can get back to that, because it's also something useful, and it's something that is implemented in a lot of policy plugins from what I can say. So I mean, I guess that's one of our ideas is to try and bring up as many useful features as possible. So yeah.
My gut is telling me that a lot of these cases we're talking about can be encompassed with the static analysis tool and then just standard logging, which most people already implement. Like that's what my gut's telling me. So yeah, irregardless of like all the implementation details. I would really like us to understand that.
Nadia, could you give a list of CNIs in the issue that implement single policy audit mode? I'd be very interested to see that.
So Nathan,
good point.
does Cilium doesn't, what do you mean by single policy? Because Cilium has audit mode. How is that different from single policy audit mode? In the
So
context of
it's
what you're
very
saying?
possible. It's one thing to turn an entire cluster into audit mode, where we know that we're not enforcing and all we care about is logging if we would. It's another thing entirely to say we want regular enforcement, but now we want this like branched out differential map that has a single policy in it, where we're going to determine whether that policy actually affects anything in the cluster.
Oh, no,
Like
no, no.
that.
I'm just talking about like you have a policy that's implemented, and whenever a packet hits that rule, allow or deny, there's a log. That's what I mean by
Sure.
logging.
Of course we have that.
Yeah.
But the question is, can you turn the specific nature of a dry run? I'd be very interested to know what CNIs implement single policy dry run modes with enforcement turned on.
Right.
Yeah, when I said like some implementations already do that, I was mostly referring to the logging feature, as it was in that context. So dry run mode is not that popular, especially on a per network policy basis. So, but I will try to like add everything that exists at least, because that's a good point.
I'm going to toss it over to Sean because he's had his hand up. Thanks for waiting, Sean.
So we have single policy audit mode in Calico Enterprise. Kind of as Nathan said, we saw it as being tied up in our enterprisey like special source as well. So a similar sort of idea there. It's quite heavily tied with our enterprise observability features. So it'd be difficult for us to do that in our open source as it's all currently structured. I think one thing, the only real advantage of putting a field in the shared API for us would be it would let us like activate that feature, but it would let CNIs that don't support it, including Calico open source, it would let them ignore the policy so they don't change. So if you put an audit policy on a cluster that doesn't support it, you don't accidentally blow up your cluster. That's the only advantage. I think we added a second data type for our we call it a stage network policy. For a stage network policy, and I don't know I wasn't heavily involved. I don't know the precise reason why we added it as a second data type, but I think part of it might be so that if you like say if your license for that feature expires, then your cluster doesn't explode because you've removed the feature. But I'm not 100% sure. That's the only advantage it would bring for us. I think in terms of implementing things just by logging, the complexity comes when you have past rules that jump to somewhere else, because then the final answer is not like the log just tells you that you would jump to your like normal network policies. And I guess with this sort of relative simplicity of AMP, that might be good enough. I mean, Calico has a more complicated policy model where there's more value in the staging, I think. But if you only have like two sets of policy, then jumping from one to the other isn't far off getting you the answer you want.
Yeah, that's very great feedback from someone who actually did that already. Thank you. Can you also please add a link to some docs maybe for this feature in our agenda so that I can link it to the issue then?
Yeah, I should be able to do that. I think, sorry, I dug it out. I think it was in the notes from last time.
Ah, that one. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I took good notes last time. It's all there.
I just think it's still like open, so I assumed it's not done or something, but yeah, maybe not.
And one thing to note, like a lot of what I've even said today, you know, like what we think is going to end up being best practice for architecting your ANP setup, we don't have any of it documented. Like I still firmly would like folks to come to the project, maybe have a cluster, and start designing their policies with the help of Policy Assistant. Like I want that to be the first, you know, it's part of our upstream payload, like it's part of our upstream tooling. I want folks to write a policy and then use Policy Assistant to better understand what's going on. But there's a line there, right? Like I really like upstream in the sense that we can help users all the way until, you know, CNI specific details or cluster specific context. And that line's pretty clean today. And I like that it is clean because it allows us to be upstream. It allows us to be a little bit abstracted away from implementation details, right? Hunter, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I guess like out of this talk, I just want to have an understanding of where we want Policy Assistant to go because like if the consensus is Policy Assistant shouldn't really look at the pods in a cluster, or like do this kind of that like check all allowed connections to this pod in your cluster. I guess like I want to
I mean,
see
it could. That'd be really cool. I
Yeah.
guess like if you can do it from a pure Cube API point of view, rather than touching the data plane, that's pretty cool, right? Like as long as we're staying in the API realm and not in the, you know, node specific realm.
Right. Yeah, I think like that is a possibility. But I guess I am still like a bit confused, like if we go this route of advocating for like the dry run CNI, like is it worth it investing efforts in the dry run for the static analysis?
I mean, the general consensus, I think, hasn't been, I don't think we have a ton of people screaming for audit mode. I heard a lot of more in this conversation, I heard more cons than pros. Maybe I'm mischaracterizing there. Nadia, I'll let you speak about it because you have your hand raised and you know more about it than me, but.
Yeah, I think just implementing that in the policy assistant makes sense anyway, because still static and dynamic analysis are very different things. And as you can see, we're probably pretty far away from like implementing this API, even if we agree on that. And people want it now. And I mean, just having that static analysis would be great, definitely. So, I mean, it has its value, even if we implement the dry run at some point. So I would vote that it makes sense to like continue working on both of these anyway.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Then I guess a last comment on this. Then I guess as like another devil's advocate to the CNI dry run, I would say like to summarize, we're using Policy Assistant to look at theoretical or all possible connections, but sometimes people might not know the exact connections. So then would it be best to suggest someone use a network observability tool like Cilium's Hubble to see all the connections happening in a cluster. And if you don't see those connections in the list of allowed ones, that be just as good as a dry run with logging. And for what it's worth, Hubble has been extended to all Linux workloads. So this wouldn't be like just when you're using a Cilium cluster, it could work with a non-Cilium cluster.
Yeah, I think that's a good first stance and thing to document, right?
Yeah.
Cool. So I'm just going to shepherd us along because we are at 45. Next one on Hunter's list, and I wanted to, as we're talking about policy assistant to Hunter, how is it going? Do you need help? Is there stuff the broader community can help with, right? Like, I know it's a pretty small team of people working on it right now.
Yeah. Yeah, so one thing that this whole discussion has made me realize is I need to help write some documentation for policy assistant, need to just like keep the momentum going there, because right now it's kind of unusable and hard to learn about. So I don't know, I might come up with some subtasks that I could request help for, but I'll have to think about that more. In the meantime, I'll probably work a bit on the documentation. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and if you want to start with, you're more than welcome to post the blog. And we can also post that, we could cross post it to the contributor blog, the Kubernetes contributor blog, which would get blasted a little wider. And that could be a really short, super short, just get your toes wet. And then you could work on the documentation like over the next little bit. So something to think about there.
Okay, yeah. And I guess as a status update for the project, Gabriel right now is just building some logic so that we can read from like clusters and like categorize things into just deployments, like so that you can see connections happening from this deployment to that one, really summarize everything instead of having to look at like every single pod.
Cool.
So
that's
kind of
awesome.
Yeah.
And if you make some good first issues, something I have never done and I probably should have done is like in Kubernetes, if you make a good first issue, someone picks it up like right away because they're seeing that at the main Kubernetes project. I need to look into if there's a way for us to kind of broadcast like, hey, we have a bunch of good first issues as a sub project, and that might help, get people in to help even more. So maybe even making like a tracking issue in Kubernetes that points back to all our good first issues in network policy API. That could be an idea.
First issue add.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Okay,
That's
yeah.
awesome.
One other thing I was thinking about, like right now, the roadmap is somewhat in my head. So is there a way we could, like, what would be the best way to put that on GitHub? Or I'm just trying to like thinking out loud, trying to understand the best way to create issues and like.
Yeah, 100%. So today, the biggest project piece we have is the GitHub project for tracking beta of the API, which has been ongoing for a long time. We could make a separate project to track policy assistant if that works. The answer is like, however you want to do it, that leaves the least amount of maintenance overhead for you, right? Like, because that's what ends up being a pain. You make this big thing for project tracking and then you have to keep updating it. We can do it however you want, like GitHub issues that are tagged with area policy assistant, whatever. And longer term, if there becomes a day where we need to break policy assistant into its own repo, even, we could talk about doing that, like if that helps facilitate things.
Okay.
So it's open-ended. I didn't give you an answer. Whatever works for you.
Sounds good. Yeah. Thanks, Henry.
Of course. Thank you. I love when I see commits flashing across my screen about policy assistant, and I never get enough time to go review them. But I love to see that things are happening. Okay. passing forward, Sean raised a good question in the agenda. ANP, BNP, same, not same, is still described in the original KEP that lives in Kubernetes enhancements. That KEP is horribly out of date. And I think originally we had been going back and updating things, Yang and I, a long time ago, but it definitely doesn't make sense to have to deal with that anymore. So what I'm tempted to do is to add a warning label to the top of that KEP, just saying, we'll leave it here. This is legacy. This was iteration number 1. All work has been moved to this other repo, Network Policy API. Do folks agree with that? Is that okay?
Sounds
Silence
good to
is
me.
comfortable.
This was the engineer who was tasked with starting to work on that. He got cut out because he Googled it and ended up on the wrong
Of
one.
Of course, yeah. No, it's a great point. I'm glad you brought it up. I know if I was going to implement it, I would be like, what the heck's going on? So I'll open a PR. Let me add that to the agenda to do that.
And I don't know if anybody has a hand raised. I wanted to point that to a related issue that I just raised. So basically for the upstream network policy API repo, we have the latest release at 1.11 right now. And we haven't had any more recent releases, which means that there are actual changes that we made to the APIs. For example, the namespace selector, right? Remember, we have the 2 levels of nesting, and now we made it to 1 level of nesting. The users won't be able to pick up that change because the manifest they're using, which is downloaded from the latest API, will still be pinged to 1.11, and that is the outdated CRD types. So if I use the latest YAML definition to create an AMP, it will actually blow up because I don't think I would say maybe no implementations has been using the latest API types yet. So I've been slacking on that, but now I try to make Antria up to date with the implementation. Then I found out that it's kind of mess up right now. So I just wanted to make sure that maybe in the very soon we wanted to cut a clean release maybe and make sure that all these changes are getting so that we have a up to date manifest that people can download and apply in the cluster.
It's been a to-do, Yang. Basically where I'm at is now the release process is a little bit more involved. When I first started this, we were moving pretty quick. I was cutting releases a lot, not a lot, but I cut 2 really close back to back. And I like to do that. But now the official guidance we've gotten from upstream from SIG Network is we need to get it reviewed by SIG Network approvers. And so I was waiting for the FQDN bits to get into the API before I cut another release, just so that they would get reviewed by upstream. That's the only thing that's been blocking me from cutting a new release. So the non-recorded guidance kind of is I have pushed latest tags so folks can experiment with a tagged version that's way closer to main. But yes, we need to cut a release as soon as possible. I'm just hoping to get FQDN in there.
All right, sounds good. Gotcha.
But with the tagged version, we still have our bundle version as the released version. So when I pick the changes from the tag version, the CRD still says it's 0.1 dot
Right.
0, like 1, whatever the main release was. So I had to manually hack it for our implementation so that it stays consistent with the version, because otherwise people were getting confused.
It's
I
super
see.
bad.
Yeah.
So if it becomes a huge blocker, we can go ahead and do it. We're just gonna have to do another one very soon. And I think the FQDN and PEP has merged. Rahul's on the call. I'm hoping soon we can have a PR up to add that to the implementation.
I was kind of thinking if we could do the 1.5, cut it at where it is, and also do one for FQDN.
Okay. Yeah, we could do that as well. It's not a lot of work for me to cut the release, so.
Sorry to interrupt. I also wanted to bring a really short discussion on this, because remember I have the issue opened, which is related to, you know, the release tag mismatch in the source code.
Yeah.
I did some research, and I think right now the best way that I can say about that is that it's probably something in the lines of if we sometimes accidentally release something and then revert it back and re-release it again, it will be really hectic because you know, for the Golang upstream Golang log or whatnot, you know, if you release something and you type, let's say, network API on the Go package, you release it, it's tagged. You know, the change set it contains, you know, it's going to be immutable whatever you do. So I was trying to experiment with that for the 1.15 tag, and I found that this was actually happening. So I think what I would recommend is that you know, for maybe when we add the FQDN back into the network policy API, let's maybe at least do like 1.16 so that we start at a clean state and we know that it won't interfere with any earlier things.
Yep. And the official thing we're going to be doing from now on is release candidate releases. So like you never will have one tag that's overwritten. Like we'll do a v0.20 or RC1 before we even think about cutting the release. And then like if there's stuff wrong, we'll do an RC2, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't have the tooling originally to do that.
Yes, that will be really good. That will be really good. Otherwise, it's kind of like messy right now for the 1.11 because
back at the beginning, like the goal was just let's get a release out. I put it all together and I did not have time to add all that other bits, but I will, or I can get help from folks if you're interested, because I don't want to be the only one who knows how to do the release.
I think it's documented, right? Like there's a release.md, we just needed to, you know, maintainers can follow that for releasing, but obviously I don't want to do that again because, you know, I don't know about the exact approvals that we should be getting before the releasing. So as you suggested, so
100%. Antonio is going to be our biggest help there. Between Antonio and Dan, I feel really confident that approval shouldn't be too hard. But good points. Okay, let's see. We got 4 minutes left. I'm just going to keep shepherding us along. What else do we have on here? Sean had a question on whose responsibility is it to ship the ANP, VNP, CRDs? Yeah, and Surya, I saw you answered it there. Is there anything else you want to note on that, Surya?
No, I hope we have good installation docs. If not, we should probably add them. Because if Sean couldn't find it, I'm worried others can't.
Just that's what everyone else is doing. We just ship it with the CNI plugin, and that's what OpenShift are going to do. And
yeah,
Cool.
that sounds fine. It's just with it having the Kubernetes name on it, you don't want to get into someone else shipping it or a separate, you know, the installer putting it in.
Right. I think it makes sense to ship with the CNI, and we should probably have, like, if we don't have docs on that, we should have a guidance on it for sure. Okay. 2 minutes left. Last but not least, just shout out to Rahul, getting the FQDN NPEP merge. That's a huge step. You can see it on our website now. One thing I wanted to note there is that on the NPEPs right now, like there's no author. I'd love to have like author on the NPEP somewhere so that folks can get credit, because it's a ton of work. And I think it's a big accomplishment to get an NPEP merge, just like it is a KEP. So if folks have ideas there that we could somehow add an author to that page, that'd be great. In line with that, Rahul, you're on the call. Is there anything you need help with now in order to actually open that PR to implement the NPEP?
I don't think so. I think all the open questions were pretty well sorted, like good enough to get us to like put it in the API and start people playing around with implementation. Yeah, we can revisit everything come beta timelines if and when we need to.
Perfect. Sounds good to me. Great news. Good work. It was a long one. Okay. Well, we are just at the top of the hour. We have some action items on the agenda. And I think that's all I have for today. Does anyone else have anything? Closing remarks?
No, yeah, thanks for the discussion, everyone. Bye.
Yeah, that was an awesome meeting. Thanks so much. Have a good day, everybody. We'll talk to you later. See you in 2 weeks.